The security camera timestamp read 2:47 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day. While I was stuck in traffic, desperately trying to make it home for our traditional 4-yao dinner, my family was already passing around the turkey, laughing and toasting with wine, glasses raised. The footage would later show my empty chair at the head of the table, deliberately removed and stored in the garage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how 28 years of being the family's invisible success story led to the most painful Thanksgiving of my life, and how that pain finally set me free. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning of Thanksgiving 2023 started like every other holiday for the past decade. I was up at 5 a.m. in my downtown Chicago apartment, not because I was cooking, but because I was finalizing the quarterly reports for my architecture firm before taking the day off. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family in suburban Naperville was probably still sleeping off their pre-holiday parties, I was working to ensure my 15 employees could enjoy their paid holiday without worrying about project deadlines. My phone buzzed with the first text of the day from my sister Rachel. "Mom wants to know what time you're bringing the dessert. She's worried about timing everything. Not good morning or happy Thanksgiving. Just another logistical demand disguised as family coordination." I typed back, "I'll be there by 3:30 with the pies. Looking forward to seeing everyone." The response came immediately. "Make sure it's the good bakery downtown, not that grocery store stuff from last year." Last year's grocery store stuff had been a custom-ordered pecan pie from one of Chicago's most acclaimed pastry chefs, but Rachel wouldn't know that. She'd been too busy photographing her own contribution, a green bean casserole from a can, to notice the handwritten note from the chef thanking me for my business. I set down my phone and looked around my apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, the morning light casting geometric patterns across the polished concrete floors. The space was featured in Architectural Digest 8 months ago, not because I'd pursued the publicity, but because one of my clients had recommended my work to their editor friend. The article had described my home as a masterpiece of minimalist design that somehow feels warm and lived in. My mother had never seen it. In 3 years of living here, despite my repeated invitations, my family had never visited. Mom always had an excuse. The drive was too long. Parking downtown was impossible, or she was too busy with Rachel's latest crisis. Rachel, meanwhile, had been to my apartment exactly once to borrow money for her divorce attorney. She'd spent the entire visit commenting on how cold and impersonal the space felt, completely missing the custom millwork I'd designed myself or the original artwork from local artists I'd commissioned. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Dad's contact photo, taken at last year's Thanksgiving, showed him mid-laugh, arm around my brother Kevin, both of them wearing matching Bears jerseys. I wasn't in the photo, having been the one taking it. "Morning, sweetheart," Dad's voice carried, the forced cheerfulness that had become his standard tone with me. "Just wanted to confirm you're still coming today. Your mother's been cooking since dawn." "Of course I'm coming," I replied, though something in his tone made me pause. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's perfect. It's just, well, Kevin and Sarah might be a little late. The baby's been fussy, and you know how it is with new parents." Kevin and Sarah's baby was now 18 months old, but I'd learned not to correct these small inaccuracies. My nephew Marcus was adorable, but his parents had been using his existence as an excuse for everything from missed family dinners to forgotten birthdays for over a year now. "That's fine," I said. "I can help Mom with the final preparations." There was a pause on the other end. "Actually, Rachel's already handling that. She took the day off work to help. Why don't you just focus on getting here safely? The roads might be busy." I glanced at my watch. It was barely 8 a.m. The roads wouldn't be busy for hours. But something in Dad's tone suggested this wasn't really about traffic. "Okay," I said carefully. I'll plan to be there by 3:30 like I told Rachel. Perfect. See you then, honey. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, looking at the 2 artisanal pies I'd ordered from Fleur de Sel, the French bakery that had a 6-week waiting list for their Thanksgiving desserts. The pumpkin tart was made with organic sugar pie pumpkins and Madagascar vanilla. The apple tarte tatin featured heirloom apples from a Michigan orchard. Together, they'd cost more than most people spent on their entire Thanksgiving meal. Not that anyone would notice or care. Last year, Rachel had pushed the dessert I'd brought to the side of the table, making room for a store-bought pumpkin pie she'd grabbed at the last minute. "This looks more traditional," she announced to the table. "Some of us don't need fancy French pastries to celebrate American holidays." I'd watched my carefully selected dessert sit untouched, while everyone praised Rachel's grocery store pie. That night, I'd taken home most of the uneaten tart and ate it for breakfast for a week, each bite a reminder of how completely invisible my efforts had become. This pattern had been building for years, but it had reached an almost comical level of absurdity. 2 months ago, I'd been featured on the cover of Chicago Magazine as one of the city's top 40 under 40 architectural innovators. The article detailed my firm's rapid growth, our sustainable design philosophy, and the 3 major awards we'd won in the past year. I'd sent the magazine to my parents, along with a note explaining that the cover story was about my work. Mom had called 2 days later to ask if I'd seen that some local architect was in the magazine. When I gently reminded her that I was the featured architect, she'd said, "Oh, that's nice, dear. Rachel's been thinking about redecorating her living room. Maybe you could give her some tips." This casual dismissal of my professional achievements had become so routine that I'd started to wonder if my family was actively trying to diminish my success, or if they simply couldn't process accomplishments that didn't fit their preconceived notions of who I was supposed to be. The evidence pointed toward the latter, but it was sometimes hard to tell. When I'd bought my first building, a small mixed-use property in Logan Square that I'd renovated into artist studios, my father had warned me about the risks of playing with real estate. When the property had tripled in value within 2 years, he'd attributed it to lucky timing, rather than my careful market analysis and renovation work. When I'd started my own firm, moving out of the prestigious but creatively stifling corporate architecture office where I'd been rising quickly through the ranks, my mother had worried aloud that I was throwing away job security for some pipe dream. When my firm had landed its first major commercial project, designing a sustainable office complex for a tech startup, she'd asked if this meant I was finally going to get back to a real job. The most painful part wasn't the dismissal itself, but the context in which it occurred. While my accomplishments were minimized or ignored, my siblings' far more modest achievements were celebrated with enthusiasm that bordered on absurd. Kevin, who worked as a mid-level sales manager at a car dealership, had been promoted to senior sales manager last spring. This advancement, which came with a modest salary increase and a slightly better parking spot, had been the subject of family conversation for months. Dad had called to share the news, Mom had posted about it on Facebook, and Rachel had thrown a congratulatory dinner party. Meanwhile, when I'd won the prestigious Architectural Innovation Award from the American Institute of Architects, recognizing my design for a low-income housing complex that had become a model for sustainable urban development, the family response had been muted. Mom had said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately changed the subject to Kevin's latest sales figures. Rachel's accomplishments received similar disproportionate attention. She worked as a dental hygienist, a respectable profession that she performed competently, but without particular distinction. When she'd completed a continuing education course in pediatric dental care, something required by her licensing board, the family had celebrated as if she'd discovered a cure for tooth decay. My parents had driven to her graduation ceremony, taken photos, and insisted on going out for a celebratory dinner afterward. When I'd completed my master's degree in sustainable architecture from Northwestern, graduating summa cum laude, they'd sent a congratulations card, The contrast wasn't lost on me, but I'd learned to navigate it by managing my expectations. I'd stopped sharing professional news unless directly asked, and I'd gradually reduced my expectations for family recognition or support. This approach had worked reasonably well for several years, allowing me to maintain family relationships without constantly feeling disappointed or frustrated. But lately, something has shifted. Maybe it was turning 30 next year, or maybe it was the growing success of my firm, but I'd started to feel increasingly isolated from my family despite our regular contact. I was present at every gathering, available for every crisis, and consistently supportive of everyone else's endeavors, but I felt like I was participating in family life as an observer rather than a valued member. This feeling had intensified over the past few months as my professional life had reached new heights. My firm had been selected to design a major mixed-use development in the South Loop, a project that would establish us as one of Chicago's premier sustainable architecture firms. The client was a European investment group with a reputation for working only with the most innovative designers, and the project would be featured in architectural publications worldwide. The contract signing had been scheduled for the week after Thanksgiving, but I hadn't mentioned it to my family. Past experience had taught me that professional achievements were more likely to be met with worry about the risks of taking on too much work than with celebration of the recognition and opportunity they represented. Instead, I'd focused on preparing for today's Thanksgiving gathering, carefully selecting the perfect desserts, planning to arrive early to help with preparations, and looking forward to spending time with my nephew Marcus, who always seemed genuinely excited to see me. At 3:15 p.m., I loaded the bakery boxes into my car and began the drive from downtown Chicago to my parents' house in Naperville. The suburbs had always felt like a different world from the city, with their wide lawns and identical houses representing a lifestyle I'd never been drawn to, but had learned to respect as my family's choice. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My parents' house was a colonial revival they'd bought when Kevin was born, before I'd even started elementary school. It was well-maintained but unremarkable, the kind of home that blended seamlessly into the neighborhood's careful uniformity. I'd always found it slightly suffocating, with its beige walls and matching furniture sets, but it was undeniably comfortable and reflected my parents' values of stability and conventionality. As I pulled into the driveway at 3:28 p.m., exactly when I'd promised to arrive, I noticed something that made me pause. Kevin's SUV was parked in the driveway, along with Rachel's sedan and a car I didn't recognize. This wasn't unusual, except that Kevin and Sarah were supposed to be running late because of the baby. I gathered the bakery boxes and walked toward the front door, noticing that the house seemed quieter than usual for a Thanksgiving gathering. Normally, I could hear conversation and laughter from the driveway, but today the only sound was my own footsteps on the concrete path. I rang the doorbell, balancing the dessert boxes in one arm while digging for my keys with the other. After a moment, I heard footsteps approaching the door, then the sound of the deadbolt turning. The door opened to reveal my mother, wearing an apron over her good dress and an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "Jessica," she said, her voice carrying an odd note of surprise. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," I replied, holding up the bakery boxes. "I brought the desserts just like we planned." Mom glanced over her shoulder, then back at me. "The thing is, sweetheart, we ended up starting a little early. Everyone was here, and Marcus was getting fussy, so we decided not to wait." I looked past her into the house where I could see the dining room table set for 5 people. Not 6, as it should have been with me included, but 5. The chairs were arranged neatly around the table, with no gap where my seat should have been. "Started early?" I repeated, checking my watch. "It's 3:30. We always eat at 4. "I know, but you know how it is with the baby," Mom said, using the same excuse Dad had offered that morning. We just thought it would be easier to go ahead and eat while he was in a good mood. I could hear voices from the dining room, Kevin's laugh mixing with Rachel's higher-pitched giggle. They were having dinner without me, and from the sound of it, they were having a wonderful time. "I'm not that late," I said, still processing what was happening. "You could have waited 30 minutes. Mom's expression softened with what might have been sympathy or might have been pity. "Of course we could have, honey. But we didn't want to risk Marcus having a meltdown during dinner. You understand?" What I understood was that my family had made a deliberate choice to exclude me from Thanksgiving dinner, and they were using my nephew as an excuse to avoid acknowledging that choice directly. The realization settled over me like a cold weight in my chest. "Where's my chair?" I asked, looking again at the dining room table that had been set for exactly the number of people who were apparently invited to participate in the meal. "What do you mean?" Mom asked, through her eyes flickered toward the garage door. "There are 5 chairs at the table," I said, my voice remaining steady despite the growing understanding of what had happened. "There should be 6. Mom's pause lasted, a beat too long. "We just thought you might want to take your desserts to go since you had such a long drive. Rachel made extra food for you to take home." Standing in my parents' foyer, holding expensive bakery boxes that no one would eat, looking at a Thanksgiving table set for 5 people instead of 6, I finally understood something that had been building for years. This wasn't about the baby's schedule or traffic concerns or timing logistics. This was about my family's decision to celebrate Thanksgiving without me, and their choice to lie about it rather than acknowledge what they'd done. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself, though that was painful enough. It was the casual dismissal of my worth, the assumption that I would accept their explanation without question, and the complete lack of consideration for how this would feel from my perspective. As I stood there, processing this moment of clarity, I realized that this Thanksgiving would mark the end of something that had been slowly dying for years. Not my relationship with my family, necessarily, but my willingness to accept being treated as an optional participant in my own family's life. "I think," I said carefully, "I'd like to understand what really happened here." The silence stretched between my mother and me as she processed my question about what really happened. Behind her, I could see Rachel emerge from the dining room, wine glass in hand, her face flushed with the kind of contentment that comes from a good meal shared with loved ones. When she spotted me at the door, her expression shifted to something resembling guilt, but only for a moment. "Oh, Jessica's here," she called over her shoulder to the dining room. "I told you she'd make it eventually." Eventually, as if I were chronically late to family gatherings, when in fact I was usually the first to arrive and the last to leave. I set the bakery boxes down on the foyer table, my hands trembling slightly with a combination of hurt and growing anger. "Can I come in?" I asked my mother, who was still blocking the doorway as if protecting the rest of the family from my presence. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, stepping aside but maintaining that odd, almost protective stance. "We just didn't want the food to get cold." I walked into the living room and immediately noticed the absence of any place settings on the coffee table or side tables. There had been no intention of including me in a later seating or making accommodations for my arrival. The dining room held the evidence. 5 place settings with obvious care taken in their arrangement, wine glasses already drained and refilled, serving dishes scattered with the remnants of a complete meal. Kevin appeared in the doorway, Marcus balanced on his hip. My nephew lit up when he saw me, reaching out his arms and babbling excitedly. At least someone was genuinely happy to see me. "Hey, Jess," Kevin said, though he couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Sorry we started without you. This little guy was getting cranky, and Sarah thought it would be better to go ahead." Sarah materialized beside him, wiping her hands on a dish towel and offering the kind of apologetic smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "You know how toddlers are," she said with a shrug. "We have to work around their schedules." I took Marcus from Kevin's arms, and my nephew immediately began playing with my earrings, completely oblivious to the tension radiating from every adult in the room. At least his joy felt genuine, uncomplicated by whatever dynamics had led to my deliberate exclusion. "I understand about toddler schedules," I said, keeping my voice level while bouncing Marcus gently. "What I don't understand is why no one called to let me know the plans had changed." The three of them exchanged glances that confirmed what I'd already suspected. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision based on Marcus's mood. This had been planned. "We thought about calling," Rachel said, taking another sip of wine, "but we figured you were probably busy with work anyway." "You always are. Always busy with work." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be effective. I did work hard, probably harder than necessary, but I'd never missed a family gathering because of work. I rearranged client meetings, postponed site visits, and worked late into the night to ensure I could be present for every birthday, holiday, and family celebration. But more than that, the comment revealed something about how my family viewed my professional life. To them, my work wasn't a calling or a passion or even a significant career achievement. It was an inconvenience that occasionally interfered with family obligations. "I'm never too busy for family," I said, handing Marcus back to Kevin. "And I told everyone I'd be here at 3:30. I was exactly on time." Dad appeared from the kitchen, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the slightly guilty expression of someone who'd been hoping to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. "Now, Jessica, don't make this into a bigger deal than it is. We had a lovely meal, and there's plenty of food left. Your mother made enough to feed an army." The patronizing tone in his voice, the suggestion that I was overreacting to a simple scheduling change, pushed me toward a decision I'd been avoiding for years. It was time to stop pretending that these patterns were accidental or well-intentioned. "Dad," I said, "how long have you had the security cameras installed?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but I'd noticed the discreet Ring doorbell camera when I'd arrived, along with what looked like additional cameras mounted under the eaves. Home security systems had become popular in their neighborhood, and my parents were always quick to adopt any technology that promised safety and convenience. "About 6 months," he said, looking confused by the change of subject. "Why?" "Just curious," I said, filing away the information for later use. "They're good quality systems. You can access the footage remotely, can't you?" "Well, yes, but I don't see what that has to do with nothing," I interrupted. I was just making conversation. But even as I said it, I was thinking about timestamp, evidence, and the potential to verify exactly when this family gathering had begun. Not that I needed technological proof to confirm what was already obvious, but something about having objective evidence felt important for what I suspected would come next. The conversation drifted into uncomfortable small talk as everyone tried to pretend that the situation was normal. Rachel showed me photos from her recent vacation to Florida, as if we were having a casual visit rather than dealing with the aftermath of my deliberate exclusion. Kevin talked about Marcus's latest developmental milestones while Sarah nodded along, both of them performing the role of gracious hosts, despite having just participated in shutting me out of the family's most important annual gathering. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself observing the scene with a strange sense of detachment. These people were my family, and I loved them, but it was becoming clear that they didn't see me the same way I saw them. To me, family gatherings were sacred occasions that required sacrifice and commitment. To them, I was apparently optional, someone whose presence was pleasant but not essential. The realization was painful, but it was also clarifying in a way I hadn't expected. For years, I'd been trying to fit into a family dynamic that had no real place for me, attempting to earn recognition and inclusion that were never going to be freely given. I'd been playing by rules that applied only to me, while everyone else operated according to a different set of expectations. Around 5:30, as the late afternoon light began to fade, I made my excuses and prepared to leave. The bakery boxes sat unopened on the foyer table, exactly where I'd left them 3 hours earlier. No one had even asked what was inside. "Take some leftovers," Mom insisted, producing a collection of plastic containers filled with turkey, stuffing, and green bean casserole. "You probably don't have much food at your apartment." The assumption that I couldn't feed myself properly was another small insult in a day full of them, but I accepted the containers to avoid prolonging the awkward farewell. Everyone hugged me goodbye with the kind of perfunctory affection that felt more like obligation than genuine warmth. As I drove back toward the city, the Chicago skyline gradually coming into view through my windshield, I felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with profound sadness. The day had been painful, but it had also been illuminating. I finally understood exactly where I stood in my family's hierarchy of importance, and that understanding, however brutal, was somehow freeing. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made a decision that had been building for years without my conscious awareness. I was done trying to earn a place in my family that would never be genuinely offered. I was done managing my expectations to accommodate their inability to see me clearly, and I was done hiding the extent of my professional success because it made them uncomfortable. What my family didn't know, what I'd carefully kept separate from our interactions for the past 5 years, was that my architectural firm wasn't just successful. It was extraordinarily successful. The magazine features and awards they'd dismissed were the visible tip of a much larger professional achievement that would have shocked them if they'd bothered to pay attention. 3 years ago, my firm was acquired by Meridian Development Group, one of Chicago's most prestigious real estate development companies. But unlike a typical acquisition where the founder might be pushed aside, Meridian had made me a partner and given me complete creative control over all their sustainable development projects. The deal had made me wealthy in ways that my family couldn't have imagined, and it had positioned me as one of the most influential architects in the Midwest. The South Loop project I'd mentioned to no one was actually 3 interconnected developments totaling over $200 million in construction value. The European investors weren't just any client. They were representatives of a consortium that was reshaping urban development across multiple continents. The contracts I'd be signing next week would establish my firm as the primary architectural partner for developments in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Detroit. I'd kept this information private not out of modesty, but out of self-preservation. Past experience had taught me that family knowledge of my financial success would immediately translate into expectations for financial support, event planning assistance, and general resource sharing that would fundamentally alter our relationships. I'd watched Kevin struggle with my parents' advice about every career decision, and I'd seen Rachel become resentful when she perceived that others in the family had advantages she lacked. But there was more to my hidden success than just financial achievement. 2 years ago, I'd been invited to join the board of directors for Chicago Tomorrow, a nonprofit organization focused on sustainable urban development. The position was typically reserved for senior architects with decades of experience. But my work on affordable housing projects had caught the attention of the city's planning commission. Through that board position, I'd become involved in policy discussions that were shaping the future of Chicago's growth. 6 months ago, I'd been approached by the mayor's office about leading a new initiative to redesign public housing across the city. The project would take 5 years to complete and would affect the lives of thousands of families. It was the kind of work I'd dreamed of doing since graduate school, the perfect intersection of architectural innovation and social impact. But perhaps most significantly, I'd been selected as one of 50 architects worldwide to participate in the Venice Architecture Biennale, the most prestigious international exhibition in the field. My installation would showcase the sustainable housing models I'd developed in Chicago, and the recognition would establish me as a global voice in contemporary architecture. None of these achievements had been shared with my family, not because I was ashamed of them, but because I'd learned that my professional life was easier to navigate without their input, criticism, or expectations. They'd demonstrated repeatedly that they couldn't celebrate my successes without diminishing them, or finding ways to make them about other family members' needs. As I sat in my apartment that evening, looking out at the Lake Michigan shoreline, and the city lights reflecting on the water, I began to formulate a plan that had been unconsciously developing throughout the day. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of integrating my hidden professional life with my family relationships, not because I needed their approval, but because I was tired of living a divided existence. The security camera footage would be my starting point. I wanted objective evidence of exactly what had happened today, not because I doubted my own perceptions, but because I suspected my family would attempt to rewrite the narrative if confronted about their behavior. Technology would provide the kind of irrefutable evidence that would make denial impossible. But more than that, I was ready to stop protecting my family from the reality of who I'd become. They'd been interacting with a version of me that existed primarily in their imagination, the struggling architect daughter who was always working but never quite successful, who could be counted on to provide effort and support, but whose own achievements were incidental to family dynamics. The real Jessica Chen was about to make her first appearance at a family gathering, and I suspected the introduction would be memorable for everyone involved. Over the next few days, I would need to decide exactly how to reveal the extent of my professional success and establish new boundaries for family interactions. But tonight, I was content to sit with the clarity that had emerged from today's painful experience. For the first time in years, I knew exactly where I stood with my family, and I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. The only question was whether they were ready for the conversation that was coming. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke to 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. My phone had been on silent since I'd returned home the previous evening, and I'd deliberately avoided checking it before bed. I'd needed time to process what had happened and solidify my resolve about how to move forward. But as I scrolled through the messages while sipping my morning coffee, it became clear that the family crisis I'd been anticipating was unfolding faster than I'd expected. The first text, sent at 6:47 a.m., was from Rachel. "Jessica, call me ASAP, emergency with mom." The second from Kevin at 7:12 a.m. "Need to talk to you about family situations. Are you available today?" The third from Dad at 7:45 a.m. "Your mother is very upset about yesterday. We need to discuss this as a family." And then, at 8:30 a.m., a message from my mother herself. "Jessica, I don't understand why you left so abruptly yesterday. I feel like there's been some terrible misunderstanding. Can we please talk?" I set down my phone and walked to my windows, looking out at the calm surface of Lake Michigan. The water was gray-blue in the early morning light, peaceful and undisturbed. In contrast, my family seemed to be in full crisis mode less than 18 hours after I'd quietly accepted their exclusion and left without causing a scene. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd been the family member who showed up in crisis situations, offering support, advice, and often financial assistance when needed. Rachel's divorce proceedings had required multiple emergency conversations and several loans to help with legal fees. Kevin's various career uncertainties had prompted family meetings where everyone brainstormed solutions to his professional challenges. Even my parents' home renovations had somehow become family projects requiring my input on design decisions and contractor recommendations. But now, when I was the one who'd been hurt and excluded, the family response wasn't to offer support or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, they seemed primarily concerned with managing my reaction to their behavior, as if my hurt feelings were the real problem that needed solving. I decided to handle the calls in order of urgency, starting with Rachel's emergency. She answered. On the first ring, her voice tight with anxiety. "Finally, I've been trying to reach you for hours." "It's 9 a.m., Rachel. I'm allowed to sleep in on holidays." "This isn't funny, Jessica. Mom is beside herself. She barely slept last night, and this morning she's convinced that you hate the whole family and never want to see us again." I paused. considering my response carefully. Did she say why she thinks I might feel that way? Because you left yesterday, without really saying goodbye, and you seemed upset about the dinner timing. Look, I know it wasn't ideal that we started early, but you're being dramatic about this whole thing. There it was, the immediate reframing of the situation to make me the problem. According to Rachel's version, my family had made an innocent scheduling adjustment, and I was overreacting to a minor inconvenience. Rachel, I said, keeping my voice steady, you had Thanksgiving dinner without me. The table was set for 5 people, not 6. My chair had been removed from the dining room. This wasn't about timing. This was about deliberately excluding me. That's ridiculous, she said, but I could hear the defensiveness in her voice. We would never deliberately exclude you. Your family. Then where was my chair? A long pause. I don't know what you're talking about. The dining room table. Yesterday, when I arrived, there were exactly 5 chairs for exactly 5 people. Where was my chair supposed to be? Another pause, longer this time. Maybe Dad moved it to make more room for Marcus's high chair. Marcus was sitting on Kevin's lap during dinner. I saw him. Well, maybe, look, I don't know the logistics of every chair in the house. The point is, you're reading way too much into this situation. The gaslighting was so complete and effortless that I almost admired its execution. Rachel had managed to acknowledge that there was no chair for me while simultaneously denying that this had any significance, and suggesting that my observation of this fact represented paranoid overthinking. I'm not reading anything into it, I said. I'm stating what I observed. 5 chairs, 5 people, dinner started an hour before I was expected to arrive. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a plan. You know what? Rachel's voice shifted to the familiar tone she used when she felt cornered. Maybe if you were around more often instead of always being buried in your work, you'd understand family dynamics better. We can't revolve our schedules around someone who treats family like an afterthought. The accusation was so unfair and so completely disconnected from reality that I felt something inside me snap. For years, I'd absorbed these kinds of comments, accepting the narrative that my professional commitments somehow made me a less dedicated family member, despite my consistent presence at every gathering and my availability during every crisis. Rachel, I said, my voice taking on a steel edge I'd never used with family before. In the past 3 years, I've attended every family birthday, every holiday, every graduation, and every family emergency. I've rearranged client meetings to be present for Marcus's first steps. I've canceled business trips to help you move apartments. I've provided financial support for your legal fees, Kevin's car repairs, and Mom and Dad's home improvements. Exactly which family obligations have I treated as an afterthought? The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice was smaller than before. I didn't mean, look, we're all just stressed about Mom being upset. She's talking about canceling Christmas because she thinks you're angry with the whole family. The manipulation was textbook. Redirect attention from the original wrongdoing to the emotional distress it had caused the perpetrator, then escalate the stakes by threatening future family events. It was a pattern I'd seen countless times in our family dynamics, but never directed at me with such obvious intent. Mom is upset because she got caught treating me badly, not because I'm angry, I said. Those are 2 very different things. Jessica, you're being unreasonable. Am I? Let me ask you something, Rachel. If you arrived at a family Thanksgiving and discovered that dinner had been served without you, your chair had been removed from the table, and everyone acted like this was a normal scheduling adjustment, how would you feel? Another long pause. That's different. How is it different? Because I would have called to check on the timing if I thought something was wrong. I was 30 minutes early to the time we'd agreed on. There was nothing wrong with my timing. Well, maybe next time. You should call ahead to confirm. The conversation was becoming surreal. Rachel was now suggesting that I should have called to confirm that my family still intended to include me in Thanksgiving dinner, as if my participation in family gatherings had become so optional that it required advance verification. "Rachel," I said, "I'm going to hang up now. When you're ready to have an honest conversation about what actually happened yesterday, let me know." "Wait, don't." I ended the call and immediately blocked her number, at least temporarily. I needed space to think without being bombarded by attempts to rewrite yesterday's events. My phone rang again within minutes. This time it was Kevin. "Hey, Jess," he said, his tone carefully casual. "I think there might be some confusion about yesterday." "What kind of confusion?" "Well, Rachel seems to think you're upset about the dinner timing, but I told her that couldn't be right. You're not the type to get worked up over scheduling stuff." Kevin was trying a different approach, appealing to my self-image as the reasonable, understanding family member who didn't cause problems over minor issues. It was more subtle than Rachel's, direct gaslighting but equally manipulative. "You're right," I said. "I don't usually get worked up over scheduling, but I do notice when I'm deliberately excluded from family gatherings." "Excluded?" "Come on, Jess. Nobody excluded you. Marcus was having a rough day, and Sarah thought it would be better to eat early rather than risk him having a meltdown during dinner. You know how he gets when he's overtired." "Kevin, when I arrived yesterday, the dining room table was set for exactly 5 people. There was no place setting for me, and there was no chair where I usually sit. That's not about Marcus's mood. That's about a deliberate decision to have dinner without me." "Maybe Sarah forgot to set a place for you in all the chaos of dealing with the baby." "And the missing chair? Did she also forget that I existed when she was arranging the seating?" Kevin was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its casual confidence. "Look, I don't know about the chair situation. Maybe Dad moved it to make room for something. The point is, no one was trying to hurt your feelings. Whether anyone intended to hurt my feelings is less important than the fact that you all made a decision to exclude me and then lied about the reasons." "That's a pretty harsh accusation, Jess." "It's an accurate observation. Tell me, Kevin, what time did you start eating yesterday?" Another pause. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 3? Maybe 3 or definitely 3. Because I have a pretty good memory of these things, and I'm curious about the precise timeline." "Why does the exact time matter?" "Because if you started eating at 3 that means you began Thanksgiving dinner an hour before I was expected to arrive, not 30 minutes early because Marcus was fussy. That suggests this was planned in advance, not a spontaneous response to a toddler's mood." Kevin's silence confirmed what I already knew. They hadn't just started early. They'd started early enough to finish the meal before I arrived, ensuring that my exclusion would be complete rather than partial. "I think you're overthinking this," he finally said, falling back on the same defense Rachel had used. "I think you're all hoping I'll accept a convenient lie, rather than dealing with the truth of what happened." "Jess, come on. We're family. Why would we deliberately exclude you?" The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I considered trying to answer it honestly. Why would they exclude me? Was it because my success made them uncomfortable? Because I'd become too independent to fit into their established family roles? Because they'd grown accustomed to treating me as optional and hadn't considered how that might feel from my perspective? But I realized that Kevin wasn't actually asking for an explanation. He was using the question as a defense, suggesting that the mere fact of our family relationship made deliberate exclusion impossible. "I don't know why you would exclude me," I said, "but the evidence suggests that you did." "What evidence? You're talking like this is a court case instead of a family misunderstanding." "You're right about one thing. This isn't a misunderstanding. Misunderstandings are accidental. What happened yesterday was intentional." I ended the call before Kevin could respond, my hands shaking slightly with accumulated anger and frustration. 2 conversations with my siblings had confirmed that they were committed to maintaining their version of events regardless of evidence or logic. They weren't interested in acknowledging what had happened or apologizing for it. They were focused entirely on managing my reaction to ensure that family dynamics could return to normal without any uncomfortable reckonings. My phone immediately started ringing again, Dad this time. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message. Jessica, your mother and I are very concerned about the misunderstanding yesterday. We think it would be best if we all sat down together to clear the air. Can you come for dinner Sunday? We can discuss this calmly and put it behind us. The message was classic family crisis management. Acknowledge that something unfortunate had happened while avoiding responsibility, then propose a family meeting designed to pressure the injured party into accepting a resolution that didn't require anyone else to change their behavior. But what struck me most was the timeline. We were still less than 24 hours from the Thanksgiving exclusion, and my family was already in full damage control mode, desperately trying to contain my reaction before it could escalate into something that might require genuine accountability. Their panic suggested that they understood the significance of what they'd done, even if they weren't willing to admit it openly, and their immediate pivot to crisis management confirmed that yesterday's exclusion had been deliberate. If it had truly been an innocent scheduling misunderstanding, they would have simply apologized and moved on. Instead, they were circling the wagons, coordinating their stories, and preparing for a confrontation they knew was coming. They were right to be worried, because what they didn't know was that I had access to something that would make their carefully coordinated denials irrelevant. Objective evidence of exactly what had happened and when. It was time to request access to those security cameras. Monday. Morning brought unexpected clarity. I'd spent the weekend ignoring increasingly frantic calls from my family while focusing on work that actually mattered, finalizing the Venice Biennale proposal and reviewing contracts for the South Loop development. The contrast between my professional life, where I was valued and respected, and my family dynamics, where I was gaslit and manipulated, had never been more stark. At 8:30 a.m., I did something I'd never done before. I called my parents' house from my office landline, knowing the number would show up as Chen Architecture Group on their caller ID. Mom answered on the second ring, her voice tight with anxiety. Chen Architecture Group? Hi, Mom. It's Jessica. Jessica? Why are you calling from work? Is everything okay? Everything's fine. I'm calling from work because I wanted to make something clear. This conversation is happening during my business hours, so I'll need to keep it brief and professional. The formal tone clearly caught her off guard. Professional? Honey, I don't understand what you mean. I mean that I'm treating this situation the way I would treat any other business relationship where trust has been broken and facts are in dispute. I'm going to need objective evidence before we can move forward. Evidence? Jessica, we're your family. What kind of evidence could you possibly need? I need to see the security camera footage from Thanksgiving Day. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in my office. When Mom finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. I don't think that's necessary, sweetheart. We can work this out by talking. Actually, I think it's very necessary. You, Rachel, and Kevin have all given me different versions of what happened Thursday, and none of them align with what I observed. The cameras will show us exactly what time dinner started, how the table was set, and when my chair was removed from the dining room. Your chair wasn't removed from anywhere, Mom said quickly. It's probably just in the garage with the extra furniture. Then the footage will show that too. When did it get moved to the garage, and who moved it? Another long pause. Jessica, I really don't understand why you're being so investigative about this. It's like you don't trust your own family. I don't trust my family right now, I said, the words coming out more easily than I'd expected. You've all lied to me about what happened, and you're continuing to lie. So yes, I need objective evidence. We haven't lied about anything. There might have been some confusion about timing, but… Mom, stop. I'm not interested in another version of the story. I want to see the security footage from 2:30 to 4:30 p.m. on Thursday. Dad said he can access it remotely. I'd like him to send it to my email address today. I'll have to talk to your father about that. Fine, talk to him. But understand that until I see that footage, I won't be participating in any family gatherings or discussions. I'm not going to sit through another conversation where everyone pretends that what I saw with my own eyes didn't actually happen. Jessica, you're being unreasonable. We can't just... I have to go, Mom. I have a client meeting in 10 minutes. Have Dad email me the footage today, or we'll have nothing further to discuss. I hung up before she could respond, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. In 30 years of family interactions, I'd never spoken to my mother with such directness or made such uncompromising demands. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. My assistant, Maria, knocked on my office door. Your 9 a.m. is here, the Meridian Group meeting about the Detroit project. Send them in, I said, grateful for the distraction of work that actually mattered. The next 3 hours were spent in productive meetings with people who valued my expertise and treated me with professional respect. The contrast with my family dynamics was so pronounced that I found myself wondering why I'd spent so many years accepting behavior from relatives that I would never tolerate from colleagues or clients. During my lunch break, I checked my email and found a message from Dad, sent at 11:47 a.m. The subject line read, "Thursday footage, let's discuss." The email itself was brief. Jessica, I've reviewed the security footage from Thursday. There are some things we should discuss as a family before you see it. Can we meet tonight? I think it would be better to handle this in person rather than through email attachments. I stared at the message for a long moment, processing its implications. Dad had the footage, he'd already reviewed it, and he didn't want me to see it. This wasn't the response of someone who was confident that the evidence would support the family's version of events. I replied immediately, I don't need to discuss anything before seeing the footage. Please send it as an email attachment by 5 p.m. today, or I'll assume you're refusing to provide it. His response came within minutes. Jessica, I really think we should talk first. The footage might be misinterpreted without proper context. Laughed out loud at that. Security camera footage requires proper context to avoid misinterpretation. The desperation was becoming comical. Dad, I typed back, security cameras record objective reality. There's no context that changes what actually happened. Send the footage by 5 p.m. At 4:47 p.m., an email arrived with a video attachment. Dad's message read, Please remember that camera angles don't always capture everything, and timestamps can be affected by various technical factors. I downloaded the file and opened it, my pulse quickening with anticipation. The footage was crystal clear, shot from a camera mounted under the front eave with a perfect view of the driveway, front door, and dining room windows. The timestamp in the corner read 2:15 p.m. when the first car arrived, Kevin's SUV. At 2:22 p.m., Rachel's sedan pulled in behind it. At 2:31 p.m., a car I didn't recognize parked on the street, probably Sarah's parents, who must have been the mystery guests I'd noticed. At 2:47 p.m., exactly the time I'd remembered from my intro, I could see figures moving around the dining room through the large front windows. They were passing dishes, raising glasses, and clearly engaged in a full meal. The timestamp was unambiguous, recorded by the camera system Dad had insisted was reliable when he'd bought it. But the most damning evidence came at 3:15 p.m. I watched my father exit through the front door, carrying what was unmistakably a dining room chair. He walked it to the garage, disappeared for about 30 seconds, then returned empty-handed. 15 minutes later, at 3:30 p.m. exactly, my car appeared in the driveway. The sequence of events was undeniable. The family had gathered at 2:15 p.m. for a 4 p.m. dinner. They'd started eating at 2:47 p.m., more than an hour before I expected. And at 3:15 p.m., with full knowledge that I would arrive in 15 minutes, Dad had deliberately removed my chair from the dining room and stored it in the garage. This wasn't a spontaneous decision based on Marcus's mood. This wasn't an innocent scheduling adjustment. This was a coordinated plan to exclude me from Thanksgiving dinner, executed with precision timing and deliberate deception. I watched the footage 3 more times, taking screenshots of the key timestamps. 2:47 p.m. Family. Eating. 3:15 p.m. Chair removal. And 3:30 p.m. My arrival. The evidence was irrefutable. At 5:15 p.m., I forwarded the video file to my entire family with a message that took me 30 minutes to compose and revise. I've reviewed the security footage from Thursday. The timestamp clearly shows that dinner began at 2:47 p.m., more than an hour before I was expected to arrive. At 3:15 p.m., Dad removed my chair from the dining room and put it in the garage, 15 minutes before my arrival. This wasn't about Marcus's schedule or any spontaneous change in timing. This was a deliberate plan to exclude me from Thanksgiving dinner. I'm disappointed that all of you chose to lie about what happened rather than simply acknowledging it. I'm even more disappointed that when caught in those lies, you've continued to deny the evidence of your own security system. I won't be attending the family dinner on Sunday, and I won't be participating in any family gatherings until you're ready to have an honest conversation about what actually happened and why. Jessica. Hit send before I could second-guess myself, then immediately turned off my phone. Whatever responses were coming, I didn't want to see them until I'd had time to process what I'd just done. For the first time in my adult life, I directly confronted my family with evidence of their bad behavior and refused to accept their explanations or excuses. I'd established a clear boundary: no family contact until they acknowledged the truth, and I'd communicated it without apology or equivocation. The feeling was terrifying and empowering in equal measure. Over the next 2 hours, I sat in my office completing work tasks while my phone buzzed incessantly with incoming calls and messages. I could see the notification numbers climbing: 12 missed calls, 27 text messages, but I didn't check any of them. At 8 p.m., I finally turned my phone back on and scrolled through the accumulated responses. They fell into predictable categories. Rachel: "This is insane. You're destroying our family over camera timestamps." Kevin: "I can't believe you're choosing to be this vindictive instead of just talking to us." Mom: "I'm heartbroken that you think we would deliberately hurt you. Please come home so we can explain." Dad: "The footage doesn't tell the whole story. There were reasons for everything that happened. What struck me most was that none of them contained an acknowledgement of what the footage clearly showed, alone an apology for lying about it. Even faced with irrefutable evidence, they were still trying to maintain their version of events through emotional manipulation and vague promises of explanations. But there was one message that was different, sent by Kevin at 7:23 p.m. "Jess, I watched the footage again. You're right about the timeline. We need to talk." It was the first crack in the unified family denial, and it gave me hope that at least one person might be ready for an honest conversation. I replied to Kevin only, "I'm willing to talk when you're ready to acknowledge what actually happened." His response came within minutes. "Can we meet tomorrow? Just you and me, no one else. Coffee at 2 p.m. The Starbucks on Michigan Avenue near my office. I'll be there." As I prepared to leave my office that evening, I reflected on how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted in just one day. This morning, my family had been coordinating their damage control efforts, confident that they could pressure me into accepting their version of events. Tonight, they were dealing with irrefutable evidence that exposed not just their original deception, but their continued lies about it. The security footage had done exactly what I'd hoped it would do. It had made denial impossible and forced at least one family member to confront the truth. Tomorrow's conversation with Kevin would reveal whether any of them were capable of the honesty and accountability that would be required to rebuild our relationships on a foundation of mutual respect rather than manipulation and denial. For the first time in years, I felt like I was operating from a position of strength rather than constantly trying to earn acceptance from people who had never intended to offer it freely. The truth, as it turned out, really was liberating. Kevin was already waiting when I arrived at Starbucks Tuesday afternoon, sitting at a corner table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was an anchor. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, with dark circles under his eyes and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept much since receiving my email with the security footage. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I sat down across from him, his voice carrying none of its usual casual confidence. "Thanks for being the only one willing to acknowledge reality," I replied, setting down my own coffee. "That's apparently a rare quality in our family." Kevin winced at the edge in my voice, but didn't try to deflect it. "I've been thinking about that footage all night, about what it means, and about how we got to this point. And what conclusions have you reached?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. When he finally looked up, his expression was painful but honest. "We planned it," he said simply. "The whole thing. We planned to have Thanksgiving without you, and then we all lied about it when you caught us." The admission hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. Despite having proof of what had happened, hearing Kevin actually say it out loud felt like a physical blow. One thing to know you've been deliberately excluded, another to hear a family member confirm that it was premeditated. "Why?" I asked, the word coming out smaller than I'd intended. Kevin's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "That's where it gets complicated and ugly. And I'm not proud of what I'm about to tell you." I waited, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. "It started about 3 weeks ago," Kevin began, his voice careful and measured. "Rachel called me and Mom to talk about Thanksgiving plans. She said she was stressed about Marcus being around too many people, and Sarah had mentioned that smaller gatherings might be better for him. But that wasn't the real reason?" "No." Kevin shook his head. "That was just the excuse we used. The real reason was that Rachel had been talking to Mom about how different you've become over the past couple of years. How you seem distant and judgmental, like you think you're better than the rest of us." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Different how? More successful, more independent. Rachel said, "You never seem impressed by anything we accomplish anymore, and you always have some bigger achievement to share whenever we talk about our lives." The accusation was so wildly disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. I'd spent years deliberately downplaying my own achievements specifically to avoid making my family feel overshadowed. "Kevin, I barely mention my work to any of you. I've gone out of my way to keep my professional life separate from family gatherings." "I know that now," he said quickly. "But at the time, Rachel made it sound like you were constantly showing off. She said you'd sent Mom that magazine article about being some big-shot architect, and it made everyone feel like you were rubbing your success in our faces. I sent the magazine because I was featured on the cover. I thought my family might want to know about it." "We didn't see it that way. Rachel convinced us that you were trying to make us feel small by comparison." I stared at him, processing the revelation that my attempt to share a career milestone with my family had been interpreted as an act of superiority. "So you decided to exclude me from Thanksgiving as punishment for being successful?" "Not punishment." "Exactly," Kevin said, though he looked uncomfortable with the distinction. "More like giving ourselves a break from feeling inadequate by having a family gathering without me. Rachel said it would be nice to have one holiday where we could just enjoy ourselves without feeling like we had to measure up to your accomplishments, where we could celebrate Marcus's milestones and my promotion without you making us feel like our achievements were insignificant." The twisted logic was breathtaking. My family had convinced themselves that my mere presence at family gatherings was an act of aggression, and that excluding me was actually self-defense against my imagined superiority complex. "Let me understand this correctly," I said, my voice deadly calm. "You all decided that my success was making you feel bad about yourselves, so rather than examining why that might be, you chose to solve the problem by excluding me from Thanksgiving. When you put it like that, it sounds terrible." "It is terrible, Kevin. It's also cruel and dishonest and completely unfair." He nodded miserably. "I know. I knew it was wrong when we were planning it, but Rachel was so convinced that you wouldn't even care that much. She said you were probably too busy with work to really want to spend time with us anyway." "Based on what evidence?" "Based on the fact that you never seem to need anything from us. You handle your own problems, you have your own life, you don't ask for help or advice or even emotional support. Rachel said it was like you'd outgrown the family." I sat back in my chair, stunned by this interpretation of what I'd thought was considerate independence. "So because I don't burden you with my problems, you concluded that I don't value our relationships?" "Something like that. And because you never seem impressed by our accomplishments, we figured you looked down on us." "I've never looked down on any of you. I've been deliberately low-key about my own work because I didn't want to overshadow anyone else's achievements." Kevin's expression shifted to something that might have been recognition. "You've been hiding your success to protect our feelings." "Yes. And apparently that made you think I was arrogant and distant." "God, Jessica, we completely misread everything, didn't we?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications. My family hadn't just excluded me from Thanksgiving. They'd built an entire narrative about my character that justified their treatment of me. They'd convinced themselves that I was judgmental and superior, when in reality I'd been going out of my way to avoid making them feel inferior. "Tell me about the planning," I said. "How exactly did you coordinate this?" Kevin looked like he wanted to refuse, but he'd already crossed the line into honesty. "Rachel organized it. She called everyone separately and explained that she thought it would be better for family dynamics if we had a smaller gathering this year. She suggested we tell you there was a schedule change due to Marcus's needs." "And everyone agreed?" Mom was hesitant at first. She said it didn't feel right to exclude you. But Rachel convinced her that it was just for one holiday and that you probably wouldn't mind since you're always so busy. "What about Dad?" Kevin's expression darkened. Dad was the most enthusiastic about it. That revelation hit harder than anything else he'd shared. Mom's participation could be explained by Rachel's manipulation, and Kevin and Rachel's involvement stemmed from their own insecurities. But Dad's enthusiasm suggested something deeper and more troubling. Why was Dad enthusiastic about excluding me? He said he was tired of walking on eggshells around your success, that every family gathering had become about managing everyone's feelings about how much better you were doing than the rest of us. The accusation was particularly painful because it came from the family member whose approval I'd always sought, most desperately. Dad had apparently been resenting my achievements for years, viewing them as a burden on family dynamics rather than something to celebrate. So the plan was to have Thanksgiving without me, and then lie about the reasons. The plan was to start early and finish before you arrived, then tell you we'd had to adjust the timing because of Marcus. We thought you'd just accept it and maybe join us for dessert or something." "And the chair removal?" Kevin looked genuinely pained. "That was Dad's idea. He said if we were going to exclude you, we should commit to it completely. Having an empty place setting would make everyone feel guilty and ruin the meal." The calculated cruelty of removing my chair 15 minutes before my arrival was somehow worse than the original exclusion. It suggested a level of planning and commitment to the deception that went beyond spontaneous decision-making. So when I arrived and noticed the table was set for 5 people, you all had your stories ready. We'd agreed to stick to the story about Marcus being fussy and needing to eat early. Rachel coached everyone on what to say. I absorbed this information, feeling a strange mix of vindication and devastation. Vindication because my perceptions had been accurate. I had been deliberately excluded, and they had coordinated their lies about it. Devastation because the level of planning and coordination required meant that multiple family members had spent weeks thinking about how to hurt me and then cover it up. "Kevin," I said, "do you understand how this feels from my perspective?" He nodded slowly. "Like, we all got together to decide you weren't worth including, then lied to your face about it." "Exactly. And when I questioned your story, you all doubled down on the lies instead of just admitting what you'd done." "We were scared," he said quietly. "Once we'd lied about it, admitting the truth would have meant acknowledging how deliberately cruel we'd been. So you chose to gaslight me instead." "I don't think we thought of it that way at the time, but yes, that's exactly what we did." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of his admissions settling between us. Kevin had confirmed everything I'd suspected and more. The exclusion had been planned for weeks, coordinated among multiple family members, and followed by a deliberate campaign of lies and manipulation when I'd questioned their story. "What happens now?" Kevin finally asked. "That depends on what the rest of the family is willing to acknowledge and do about it." "What do you mean?" "I mean that an apology isn't enough here. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding that got out of hand. This was a coordinated campaign to hurt me and then lie about it. That kind of behavior doesn't get fixed with a simple, 'sorry.'" Kevin looked nervous. "What kind of changes are you talking about?" "Honest acknowledgement from everyone involved, not just admission that the exclusion happened, but recognition of why it was wrong and what led to it, and changes in how the family operates going forward." "Like what?" "Like ending the pattern where my accomplishments are treated as threats to everyone else's self-esteem. Like stopping the assumption that I don't need or want family support just because I'm independent. Like actually including me in family decisions instead of making plans around my absence." Kevin was quiet for a long moment. "Those are big changes. I'm not sure everyone will be willing to acknowledge that the family dynamics need that much adjustment. Then we have a problem, because I'm not willing to go back to the way things were." "What if they refuse?" The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding since this whole situation began. What was I willing to sacrifice to maintain? Family relationships that had never been particularly healthy or supportive? "Then I'll continue to live my life without them," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I have a career I love, friends who value me, and a life that doesn't depend on family approval or inclusion." Kevin's eyes widened. "You'd really cut ties with the family?" "I'd prefer not to. I love all of you, despite everything that's happened. But I won't continue to participate in family dynamics that require me to diminish myself or accept being treated as optional." "Jessica, you can't just— I can't what? Choose my own well-being over dysfunctional family patterns? Choose honest relationships over ones based on lies and manipulation? But we're family. Family isn't a free pass for cruel behavior, Kevin. Being related to someone doesn't give you the right to hurt them and then demand they pretend it didn't happen." Kevin looked stricken, probably realizing for the first time that the family's actions might have consequences beyond a temporary period of tension. "Will you talk to the others?" he asked. "If I can get them to admit what really happened and apologize properly? If they're genuinely ready to acknowledge the truth and change how they operate, yes. But I'm not interested in another performance designed to get me back to accepting unacceptable treatment. How will I know if they're being genuine?" "They'll have to acknowledge the specific things they did wrong, explain why they thought that behavior was acceptable, and outline concrete changes they're committed to making. And they'll have to do it without making excuses or trying to blame me for their choices." Kevin nodded slowly. "That's going to be a difficult conversation." "It should be difficult. What they did was difficult for me to experience, and what they're going to have to acknowledge about themselves won't be comfortable. And if they can't do it, then you'll all have learned something important about who you are and what you value." And I'll have learned something important about what kind of relationship, if any, I want to maintain with this family. As Kevin. And I prepared to leave. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something that might have been respect mixed with sadness. I'm sorry, Jessica. For all of it. For planning it. For lying about it. And for not understanding how wrong it was until you forced us to see it clearly. Thank you for being honest with me today. That took courage. It shouldn't have taken courage to tell my sister the truth. No, I agreed. It shouldn't have. But the fact that it did tells us everything we need to know about how broken our family dynamics have become. As I walked back to my office, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Kevin's honesty had provided closure about what had actually happened, but it had also revealed the depth of resentment and misunderstanding that had been building for years. The path forward, if there was one, would require more than apologies. It would require fundamental changes in how my family saw me and how they treated differences in achievement and independence. Whether they were capable of that kind of growth remained to be seen. 3 days after my conversation with Kevin, I received an email that surprised me. It wasn't from any family member, but from Sarah, Kevin's wife. The subject line read, "An apology long overdue." Jessica, it began, Kevin told me about your conversation and what really happened on Thanksgiving. I need you to know that I was against the plan from the beginning, but I was too cowardly to speak up. I told myself that it wasn't my place to interfere in family dynamics, but that was just an excuse for taking the easy path. You deserved better from me, and I'm sorry I failed you. The message continued for several paragraphs, detailing how uncomfortable she'd felt during the planning conversations and how guilty she'd been throughout the actual dinner. She described watching my parents coordinate their lies and feeling sick to her stomach about participating in the deception. What struck me most, she wrote, was how relieved everyone seemed to be without you there. Not because you're difficult or judgmental, but because your presence apparently reminded them of their own insecurities. That's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to manage. I hope you know that not everyone in the family shares that perspective. Sarah's email was unexpected in its honesty and depth of reflection. She'd recognized something that even Kevin had struggled to articulate clearly, that the family's resentment of my success said more about their own issues than it did about my behavior. I replied, thanking her for her honesty and her courage in reaching out. Her message gave me hope that perhaps some family relationships could be salvaged if people were willing to examine their own motivations honestly. That hope was tested the following evening when my phone rang at 8:30 p.m. Mom's number appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Hi, Mom." "Jessica, thank you for taking my call." Her voice was subdued, lacking its usual cheerful authority. "I know you're angry with us, and I understand why." "Do you?" I asked. Because the conversations I've had with Rachel, and initially with Kevin, suggested that no one really understood what they'd done wrong. Kevin told me about your coffee meeting, about what he admitted to you. And? There was a long pause before she continued. And I realized that we owe you more than an apology. We owe you the truth, and we owe you an acknowledgement of how badly we've handled this whole situation. This was different from the defensive denials I'd been hearing for days. Mom's tone carried a weight of genuine remorse that I hadn't heard before. "I'm listening," I said. "The truth is that you're right about everything. We planned to exclude you from Thanksgiving. We lied about the reasons, and then we doubled down on those lies when you questioned them. And the worst part is that we did it because we've all been struggling with our own feelings of inadequacy compared to your success." The admission was more direct and comprehensive than anything I'd expected from her. "Tell me more about that." "Over the past few years, watching your career grow and your independence develop, I've felt increasingly like a failure as a mother. Not because of anything you've done, but because I couldn't understand or support what you were building. Your achievements highlighted everything I didn't know about your life and everything I hadn't contributed to your success. This was a level of self-reflection I'd never heard from my mother before. She was acknowledging not just the specific wrongdoing, but the deeper emotional patterns that had led to it. Instead of dealing with those feelings or trying to bridge the gap between us, she continued, I let Rachel convince me that the problem was your attitude rather than our inability to connect with your world. It was easier to believe that you thought you were better than us than to admit that we'd failed. To maintain a meaningful relationship with you. Mom, I said gently, I never thought I was better than anyone. I've been trying not to make anyone feel bad about our different circumstances. I know that now. Your brother helped me see that your discretion about your achievements wasn't arrogance, it was consideration. You were protecting our feelings at the expense of sharing your successes with people who should have been celebrating them. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Mom talked about her own unfulfilled ambitions, her regrets about not pursuing career goals when she was younger, and her struggle to understand a daughter whose life looked nothing like her own. She acknowledged that she'd been living vicariously through Rachel and Kevin's more conventional achievements because they were easier for her to understand and celebrate. What hurts most, she said, is realizing that I've been so focused on my own discomfort with your success that I never stopped to appreciate what an extraordinary person you've become. You built a successful business, you maintain your independence, you handle your own problems, and you've never asked us for anything. Those should be sources of pride, not resentment. They could still be sources of pride, I said, but that would require some fundamental changes in how the family operates. What kind of changes? Changes like the ones I discussed with Kevin. Acknowledging that different people have different kinds of success, and that no one's achievements diminish anyone else's. Changes like including me in family decisions, rather than making assumptions about what I want or need. Changes like being honest about conflicts instead of coordinating lies to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Those are significant changes, Mom admitted. I'm not sure everyone will be ready for them immediately. Then they'll have to decide what matters more, maintaining unhealthy patterns or preserving family relationships. And if they choose the patterns, then they'll be choosing to prioritize their comfort over our relationship. That's their right, but it's also their loss. The conversation with Mom lasted over an hour, covering ground we'd never explored before. She asked questions about my work that she'd never thought to ask, expressed genuine interest in my Venice Biennale project, and admitted that she'd never visited my apartment because she was intimidated by the success it represented. I'd like to see your home, she said near the end of our call. If you'd be willing to have me visit, I think it's time I stopped being afraid of your accomplishments. I'd like that, I said, meaning it. But only if you're genuinely ready to see me as I am, not as you think I should be. I'm ready to try. 2 days later, Rachel called. Unlike my conversations with Kevin and Mom, this one was immediately contentious. I don't appreciate Kevin sharing private family conversations with you, she began without preamble. You mean Kevin telling me the truth about what you all planned? I mean Kevin violating the trust of family discussions to make himself look better at everyone else's expense. The deflection was classic Rachel. When caught in wrongdoing, attack the messenger rather than addressing the behavior. Rachel, Kevin, didn't betray any trust. He acknowledged his participation in a plan to hurt me, and he took responsibility for his role in lying about it. That's called accountability. It's called throwing the rest of us under the bus to save himself. No, it's called being honest, something you might consider trying. There was a pause before Rachel continued, her voice tight with anger. Fine. You want honesty? Here's honesty. I organized Thanksgiving without you because I'm tired of feeling like the family failure every time we're all together. At least she was admitting her role, even if her motivation seemed to be anger rather than genuine remorse. In what way do I make you feel like a failure? Are you serious? You have this amazing career, this incredible apartment, this whole sophisticated life, and you act like it's no big deal. Meanwhile, I'm working the same job I've had for 5 years, living in the same rental house, dealing with my ex-husband's drama, and every family gathering becomes a reminder of how differently our lives turned out. The honesty was brutal, but it was also revealing. Rachel's resentment wasn't really about my behavior. It was about her own disappointment with her life choices and circumstances. Rachel, I've never said or done anything to suggest that your life is less valuable than mine. You don't have to say it. It's obvious just from looking at the contrast between us. That contrast exists, but it doesn't mean either of us should feel bad about our different paths. Easy for you to say. You're the one who ended up successful. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it became clear that Rachel wasn't interested in self-reflection or accountability. She was interested in justifying her behavior by blaming me for her feelings about her own life. She wanted me to acknowledge that my success was somehow an attack on her self-esteem, and she wanted me to apologize for making her feel inadequate by comparison. When I refused to accept responsibility for her insecurities, she escalated to threats about family unity and accusations that I was destroying relationships out of pride and stubbornness. Rachel, I finally said, I hope you find a way to make peace with your own choices and circumstances. But I'm not going to apologize for my life or accept blame for your feelings about yours. So that's it? You're just going to cut me off? I'm going to maintain boundaries that protect my well-being. If those boundaries are incompatible with the relationship you want, then yes, this might be where our regular contact ends. You're choosing your career over your family. I'm choosing honesty and respect over manipulation and resentment. If you ever decide those are things you want in our relationship, let me know. I ended the call feeling drained but clear about where things stood. Rachel was not ready for the kind of honest self-examination that would be required to rebuild our relationship on a healthy foundation. The final family conversation came 3 days before Christmas. Dad had requested a phone call, and I'd agreed, curious to see how he would handle the revelations about his enthusiasm for my exclusion. Jessica, he began, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. I'm listening. Kevin told me about your conversation, and your mother shared her reflections with me. I need to acknowledge my role in what happened at Thanksgiving, and I need to explain something about my own behavior that I'm not proud of. His tone was formal, but genuine, carrying the weight of someone who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. For the past several years, I've been resentful of your independence and success, not because I'm not proud of what you've accomplished, but because your achievements highlighted my own failures as a father. This was not what I'd expected him to say. What do you mean? I mean that watching you build a successful career without my guidance or support made me realize how little I'd contributed to your development. Your brother comes to me for advice about career decisions, financial planning, major life choices. Your sister calls when she needs help problem solving. But you handle everything yourself, and I interpreted that as evidence that you didn't value my input or guidance. The revelation was both painful and illuminating. Dad had been interpreting my independence as rejection rather than capability. I wanted to be needed by my children, he continued, and your self-sufficiency made me feel irrelevant. So when Rachel suggested having Thanksgiving without you, I saw it as an opportunity to enjoy family time without that reminder of my own inadequacy as a parent. Dad, I never meant to shut you out. I just didn't want to burden you with problems I could handle myself. I understand that now. But at the time, it felt like you'd outgrown needing a father, and that was harder for me to accept than I realized. The conversation that followed was awkward but necessary. Dad acknowledged that his enthusiasm for excluding me had been driven by his own ego needs rather than any legitimate family concern. He apologized not just for participating in the Thanksgiving plan, but for years of subtle resentment that had influenced how he treated me at family gatherings. "I'd like to try building a different kind of relationship with you," he said. "One based on mutual respect rather than my need to feel useful or important." "I'd like that too," I said. "But it will require accepting that I'm an independent adult who doesn't need parenting, even though I still value having a father." I'm ready to learn that distinction. As December progressed, it became clear that my family was splitting into two camps: those who were willing to examine their own behavior and change, Mom, Dad, Kevin, and Sarah, and those who preferred to maintain existing patterns, Rachel. Vichu. Division was painful but necessary. Some relationships would require rebuilding from the ground up, while others might not survive the demand for honesty and accountability. But for the first time in years, I was optimistic about the possibility of having authentic family relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation and denial. The truth, as difficult as it had been to establish, was proving to be the foundation for something better than what we'd had before. 6 months after Thanksgiving, that changed everything. I found myself standing in my apartment, preparing to host my first family gathering in my own space. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken being excluded from my family's home to finally invite them into mine. The past months had been a journey of rebuilding some relationships while accepting the end of others. Not everyone had been willing or able to do the work required to move forward, but those who had made the effort had discovered something neither they nor I had expected: authentic connection based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Mom arrived first, at exactly 6 p.m. as we'd arranged. She stood in my entryway, taking in the space she'd avoided visiting for 3 years, her expression a mixture of awe and something that might have been regret. "This is beautiful, Jessica," she said, her voice carrying genuine appreciation rather than the defensive dismissal I'd grown accustomed to. "I can see why that magazine featured it." She'd not only kept the Architectural Digest issue I'd sent her, but had apparently read it carefully enough to reference specific details from the article. The simple gesture represented months of effort on her part to understand and value aspects of my life she'd previously dismissed. "Thank you for coming," I said, meaning it in ways that went far beyond simple politeness. Over the past 6 months, Mom and I had been rebuilding our relationship through weekly phone calls and monthly visits. The conversations had been awkward. At first, both of us learning how to interact without the established patterns that had defined our relationship for decades. She'd been learning to see me as an accomplished adult, rather than a daughter who'd somehow gotten off track. And I'd been learning to trust that her interest in my life was genuine, rather than performative. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been setbacks and misunderstandings, moments when we'd both fallen back into old patterns before catching ourselves. But the foundation we were building felt solid in a way our previous relationship never had. "Tell me about the Venice Project," she said as I poured wine. "I want to understand what it means for your career." 6 months ago, Mom wouldn't have known about the Venice Biennale, let alone understood its significance. Now she asked informed questions about the timeline, the other architects involved, and the impact the exhibition might have on sustainable housing policy. The difference represented hundreds of hours of effort on her part to educate herself about my professional world. Dad arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing an expression of nervous anticipation. His relationship with me had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone in the family. "Jessica," he said, offering the flowers with a slight awkwardness that revealed how carefully he was thinking about our interaction. "Thank you for including me in this." The formality might have seemed strange to an outside observer, but it represented important progress for us. Dad had spent months learning to relate to me as an independent adult, rather than a daughter whose success somehow reflected his failure as a parent. The process had required him to examine decades of assumptions about fatherhood, achievement, and family roles. "I'm glad you're here," I said, accepting the flowers. "I've been looking forward to showing you the space." What followed was a tour unlike any we'd shared before. Instead of the superficial observations that had characterized his previous visit, Dad asked detailed questions about my design choices, the renovation process, and the integration of sustainable features throughout the apartment. He listened to my answers with genuine attention, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated real engagement with the subject matter. "This is impressive work," he said, as we concluded the tour in my home office, where architectural drawings and project models were displayed on custom-built shelving. "I'm beginning to understand why your career has developed the way it has." The acknowledgement might have seemed minimal, but coming from someone who had enthusiastically participated in excluding me from family gatherings because my success made him uncomfortable, it represented profound personal growth. Kevin and Sarah arrived with Marcus just as I was setting the table. My nephew, now 2.5, ran toward me with the uninhibited joy that had always characterized our relationship. Whatever confusion and manipulation had defined adult family dynamics, Marcus had remained a source of uncomplicated happiness. "In my life, Aunt Jess," he shouted, wrapping his arms around my legs. "Big house!" "It is a big house," I agreed, lifting him up so he could see the lake view from the dining room windows. "Do you want to help me finish setting the table?" Marcus nodded enthusiastically, and for the next 10 minutes, I guided him through placing napkins at each chair while the adults finished arriving and greeting each other. The simple domestic scene felt both familiar and entirely new. Family members in my space, but interacting according to patterns we'd consciously chosen rather than unconsciously inherited. Kevin had been the family member most committed to examining and changing his own behavior over the past months. The guilt he'd felt about participating in the Thanksgiving exclusion had motivated deep reflection about his own insecurities and their impact on family relationships. "I've been thinking about what you said about family dynamics," he said as we arranged chairs around the dining room table, "about how achievements shouldn't be competitive within families. What conclusions have you reached?" "That I've been so worried about not measuring up to your success that I never stopped appreciating what you were actually accomplishing. I was so focused on my own feelings of inadequacy that I missed celebrating my sister's extraordinary achievements." The conversation that had taken months to develop was now happening naturally, without the defensive posturing that had characterized our interactions for years. "Your success doesn't diminish mine," he continued, "and my accomplishments don't become less meaningful because yours are more visible. I wish it hadn't taken nearly losing our relationship for me to understand that." Sarah had been quietly supportive throughout the rebuilding process, often serving as a translator between family members who were struggling to communicate directly. Her outsider perspective had been invaluable in helping others recognize patterns they'd been too close to see clearly. "This feels different," she observed as we gathered around the table. "Calmer, but also more real." She was right. The dinner conversation that followed was unlike any family gathering I could remember. Instead of the careful avoidance of difficult topics that had characterized previous meals, we engaged directly with questions of career development, family dynamics, and personal growth. Mom asked detailed questions about my current projects and their social impact. Dad shared his own reflections on achievement and parenting, acknowledging ways his own competitive instincts had affected his relationship with his children. Kevin talked about his plans for professional development and how he was learning to find satisfaction in his own progress rather than comparison with others. The conversation wasn't without awkward moments. Decades of dysfunctional patterns don't disappear overnight, and we occasionally catch ourselves falling into old habits. But the difference was that now we noticed and corrected these lapses instead of pretending they hadn't occurred. "I keep waiting for Rachel to walk through the door," Mom said during dessert, voicing what we'd all been thinking. Rachel's absence was the evening's most significant presence. Despite multiple attempts at reconciliation, she had remained committed. to her position that I was destroying family unity by refusing to accept responsibility for her feelings about her own life circumstances. "I tried calling her yesterday," Kevin said. "She hung up when I mentioned tonight's dinner." The situation with Rachel represented the most painful aspect of the past 6 months. While other family relationships had been rebuilt on stronger foundations, her refusal to engage in honest self-reflection had created an unbridgeable gap between us. "I miss her," I said honestly. "But I can't maintain a relationship that requires me to apologize for my existence or accept blame for her unhappiness." "She might come around eventually," Dad offered hopefully. "She might," I agreed. "But only if she decides that an honest relationship is more valuable than maintaining her resentment. That's not a decision I can make for her." The conversation that followed was one we'd needed to have for months, acknowledging that family relationships, like all relationships, require mutual effort and good faith participation from all parties. Rachel's choice to prioritize her grievances over reconciliation was painful, but it was her choice to make. "What you've built here," Sarah said, gesturing around the table, "with the people who were willing to do the work, this is what family should feel like." She was right. The 5 adults and 1 toddler gathered around my dining room table represented family not as an accident of birth, but as a conscious choice to prioritize honesty, respect, and mutual support over convenience and tradition. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that painful Thanksgiving 6 months earlier. The exclusion from my family's dinner had forced me to confront the reality that some relationships were built on foundations too damaged to support authentic connection. But it had also created space for something better to emerge. The family, members who had been willing to examine their own behavior and commit to genuine change, had discovered that honesty, however initially uncomfortable, created possibilities for connection that performance and denial could never achieve. "Thank you for tonight," Mom said as she prepared to leave. "For your patience with all of us, and for not giving up on the relationships that could be salvaged." "Thank you for being willing to do the work," I replied. "For caring enough about our relationship to change patterns that weren't serving either of us." Dad's goodbye was characteristically awkward but genuine. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," he said. "Not just professionally, but in how you've handled this whole family situation. You've shown more maturity and grace than any of us deserved." Kevin and Sarah lingered longest, Marcus having fallen asleep in his father's arms during the after-dinner conversation. "This feels like a new beginning," Kevin said. "Not just for tonight, but for all of us." He was right. What we'd built over the past 6 months wasn't a return to previous family patterns, but something entirely new. Relationships based on choice rather than obligation, honesty rather than performance, and mutual respect rather than inherited roles. After everyone left, I stood in my kitchen, washing dishes and looking out at the Chicago skyline. The city lights reflected on Lake Michigan's surface, creating patterns that shifted with the water's movement. The view was beautiful, but it was also symbolic of something I'd learned over the past months: that stability doesn't require rigidity, and that the most beautiful patterns often emerge from accepting change rather than resisting it. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. "Venice Biennale Committee confirmed your installation space. Congratulations. This is going to be incredible." The professional validation was gratifying, but it was no longer the primary source of my sense of worth or belonging. I'd learned to value recognition from those who understood my work, while building personal relationships that didn't depend on external achievement for their foundation. Another text arrived, this time from a number I didn't recognize. "Jessica, this is Rachel. I saw the photos Mom posted from tonight's dinner. Maybe we could talk sometime." I stared at the message for a long moment, considering my response. The past 6 months had taught me the importance of boundaries, but they'd also shown me the Value of remaining open to genuine change when people were ready for it. I typed back, I'd be willing to talk when you're ready for an honest conversation about what happened and what would need to change moving forward. Her response came quickly. I think I might be ready for that conversation. Then let's schedule it, I replied. But only if you're genuinely prepared to examine your own behavior rather than continuing to blame me for your feelings about your life. A longer pause this time, then. I've been doing some thinking. Maybe it's time I stopped blaming you for my problems. As I finished cleaning up from the dinner and prepared for bed, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with perfect outcomes or restored relationships. Some family connections had been rebuilt on stronger foundations, others had ended, and one might be beginning the difficult process of starting over. What mattered most was that I was no longer living divided between my authentic self and the version my family had been comfortable with. The security camera footage that had exposed their Thanksgiving deception had done more than provide evidence of their wrongdoing. It had forced all of us to confront the reality of our family dynamics and make conscious choices about what kind of relationships we wanted to build moving forward. The truth, as painful as it had been to establish, had indeed set us free. Not free from the complexity of family relationships, but free from the pretense and denial that had prevented those relationships from reaching their potential. Standing in my apartment that night, surrounded by the life I'd built and the relationships I'd chosen to maintain, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete alignment between who I was and how I was known by the people who mattered most. It had taken 28 years and one devastating Thanksgiving dinner to reach this point, but the foundation we'd built was solid enough to support whatever came next. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.